My research was on music and identity and how the two are related to each other. So first off, why is identity important? Identity is important as it is who we are and it dictates our actions. And any benefits to this identity, such as through a variable such as music, is necessary for us to research and know about. Alberto Quevedo Mas from the University of Jaime I of Castellón stresses the importance of musical identity. He says, quote, musical identity may create a new basis to share with classmates instead of the negative labels derived from displacement, economic shortages, or human losses. Children assume this identity subconsciously, but it allows them to effectively transition from the social non-place to the recovery of a social place. A non-place is a social place in which the person puts themselves as insignificant due to past trauma. Music can lift people out of drastic situations simply by augmenting their identity. Malk Shalby found that Black music is a communication space where dialogue on belonging and identity takes place, both allowing boundaries to be crossed and defining affiliations. Black music links people all around the world. Kate Fitzpatrick, the assistant professor of music at the University of Michigan, says that, quote, culturally relevant pedagogy is discussed as a way to improve school music curricular and student cultural identity. Henry Wanjala with the Department of Music and Dance at Kenyatta University says, quote, we have argued that popular music not only has a critical index in understanding, but also plays a significant role in shaping, influencing, and negotiating identity formation among the youth. Music offers more than mere entertainment. Gulia Rapani from the University of Michigan says, quote, children are also referred to music as both an individual experience and a social activity. This leads me to my research questions. They're split in between two. How does music form identity, and how do these identities play into your music taste? Now for the presentation of articles. My first article was Ebuka Elias Igwebuki from the Federal University Edufu Alike in Nigeria. He asked, how do songs serve a role to articulate metaphors for identities and ideologies in Egwu Ekwelis, which is a Nigerian folk music, specifically to the Igbo land, which is a region within Nigeria, and how do these serve a role in the creation of the songs themselves? He looked at general themes within songs and analyzed them, and he found that, quote, Egwu Ekwelis is indeed a highly dynamic and symbolic Igbo folk music, which in the Igbo land in particular and in Nigeria in general, that and it distinguishes it from other genres is its conventional use of conceptual and conventional metaphors to articulate salient Igbo identities and ideologies and representing critique political power structures and relations. This contextualized my research question, specifically the part on identity, how identity affects music, as this study looked into how metaphors are apparent within music. My second source was Marika Nadar Shivieli, who was with the State Conservatoire of Georgia, the country. She asked, how is one's identity national and others manifested by composers? Is musical identity always related to nationality? She compared stylistic features and composition techniques within certain composer songs, and she found that, quote, musical identity always coincides with nationality, and this is manifested in these two composers' creative work. From this standpoint, the musical identity of both composers turns out to be deeply national. This study contextualized my method. While I did not specifically do a meta-analysis looking at stylistic features and composition techniques, I did use the way she framed her research, which was looking at distinct variables of identity, for example, nationality or childhood experiences. And I used those to kind of frame my questions within my survey. Finally, the last source is Amaya Lamit Jorgando from the European University Institute in Italy. She asked, which songs did they perform and listen to, or what role did these songs play in the space of construction of their identity as Basques? She was asking this specifically about residents of the Basque region in Spain after the Franco dictatorship and how they came together as a community through music. She looked at interviews, memoirs, newspaper articles, and reports from the Franco dictatorship during the time period, and she found that music provided Basque nationalists with an opportunity to identify with the Basque community, while it also offered them a means to express themselves and face the challenges of their transformed world. This contextualized my research question, specifically to music and identity, how music affects identity, as she found that community identity was built off of the music throughout the Basque region. For my methodology, I did an anonymous survey, and I got background info on these participants. I used the Likert scale, so strongly disagree to strongly agree, and a set definition of identities to use. So I use this so that first it would be quantitative, the Likert scale, and then also all answers would be under the same definition of identity instead of someone's own definition. So the identity definitions I used were Oxford Dictionary, quote, the characteristics, feelings, and beliefs that makes people different from others. Shahram Hashmat, an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Springfield, defined identity as it relates to our basic values that dictate the choices we make, for example, in relationships and career. These choices reflect who we are and what we value. And finally, Brent Talbot, who is an associate professor and coordinator of music at Gettysburg College, defined musical identity as a perception of one's musical self as a learner, teacher, performer, improviser, composer, listener, and consumer. Finally, I had 3 different sections. I gathered stereotypes around the identities of music to see if these would be correct with the actual answers. And then I also had questions both on how music affects identity and how identity affects music. Finally, I used correlational statistics in between different questions to see if they were related to each other in some way or fashion. Finally, all questions were meant to be a variable of identity, and a specific part of it. So for example, nationality or beliefs are a certain part of your identity. So for results, this was the overarching question of the entire study. 1 means strongly disagree, 5 means strongly agree, and all in between. This question was used as a base for almost all questions, and it's correlated to almost all of them. Correlation coefficients were calculated to almost all of them. This is a certain variable. My beliefs have been altered by the music I listen to. It is a variable within the definition of identity. So most people seem to disagree, and when correlated with the last question of my identity has been changed through music, it was found to be moderate correlation. It was about 0.49. So not necessarily, but it could be in some cases. The high values would go with other high values or low and low. My lifestyle is another similar variable to beliefs, and on first glance, due to the shift in more people going towards agree, we'd assume that this is a way that many people have changed their identity through music, but when used in correlation of data, again, it was moderate correlation, about 0.51 this time. For the results within the identity and music section, I frequently think about my musical identity, so again, I gave the definition of identity specifically for this question and a few other questions. When correlated to the question of my identity has been changed through music, this was the highest correlation within the entire study, so it was about 0.65. And then I grew up with the nation's culture being a large part of our family tradition. This question was, in past research, it seemed that nationality always coincides with musical identity, but when actually used in this study, specifically with this participants, it was a 0.1478 correlational coefficient, so it went against past information. Again, another variable within identity, experiences growing up, and again, this was actually the only negative correlation in the entire study when correlated against the question of identity has been affected by music. It was negative 0.2. Finally, for the last question, I relate to the beliefs and experiences that are portrayed in the lyrics in my favorite genre of music. This was pretty much no correlation, 0.14, when correlated back to identity change through music. Finally, I also asked questions on stereotypes to see if any of these would be true. I asked if genres were stereotypes, so for example, country and rap. And when it through the data, generally classical listeners were the highest scoring genre within identity being affected throughout all questions other than one. It was I relate to the beliefs and experiences in my favorite genre. And then pop was the most basic. Very few people changed their identity through listening to pop music. And then right in the middle was were genres like country and rap. So despite them being very highly stereotyped, 68% for country, 58% for rap, they were right in the middle, so people would either be on the high end of it changing their identity or the low end or right in the middle. Now for my discussion and implications. Through past research, we saw that nationality always coincides with musical identity. And this was not only found in Nadar Sheveli, which was in my lit review, but also by another source, Brigado David Johns. But through my study, it doesn't seem that that is particularly clear, specifically within a community of people. This may be due to the fact that it is not distinct to only writers of music and composers, whereas their studies were only on composers. So as a community and as listeners, we may not necessarily always coincide with nationality. Furthermore, classical music is generally the highest identity within music, which is also coincides with past research. So Nadar Sheveli, David Johns, and Brent Talbot all found that as well. Finally, for my limitations. One limitation was the demographic of respondents. My survey was mainly sent out to an all-boys Catholic high school, so most respondents were within the age range of 13 to 18, as well as were male. It was about 80% for both. While I got a good amount of respondents, these similar demographics didn't allow me to correlate things like age to identity or gender, as I didn't have enough to really do female or any other age other than 13 to 18. Another limitation of the study was that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. While correlation statistics show that they're correlated, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is always true. Survey also does not allow for narratives and open-ended questions. I had to change the survey so that it would specifically be quantitative, so that all answers would be the same and I could use correlational data instead of allowing people to really tell me specifically how their identity was changed. Instead, they had to just quantify it on a numerical scale. These are my sources. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nathan. I got a couple of oral defense questions for you, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so for the first one, think way back to your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation around this particular issue. How did that exploration lead to where you are today with your final conclusion? Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, so a large part of the scholarly exploration, a large part of it was they would do meta-analysis more, and I saw this gap in research. There were a few that did surveys and specifically looked and quantified it, but it was a very small percentage, so I decided that I would do a quantitative analysis of it and use correlational statistics. So then I used that to inform my method. So, and then by then I used very similar questions that they asked in interviews more so. I used very similar questions to my survey, and then I would look back in between and see how the different answers are either differed or were similar.
Terrific. How did the limitations in your method or the data that you collected, how did that influence your final understanding? What way in which the limitations sort of held back from a more full conclusion?
Yeah, so one way that it really limited my conclusion was that it was only on a communal aspect and not necessarily on an individual basis. Instead of seeing the narratives, if I did a different study in which I asked for narratives themselves and for the stories, I would instead be able to do an individual, see how individuals specifically responded. Instead, my survey, due to being quantitative only, it was more on a communal basis and seeing how a large community of respondents would respond.
Okay, good. And then the last question. Think back to the initial curiosity that made you choose this particular study. As a result of sort of experiencing this entire process, do you have any new curiosities? Like if you were to do another research project, maybe what would you focus on now based on what you've learned?
I think I would do a more narrative focused study, specifically looking into different demographics that I wasn't able to really reach with my survey. So for example, seeing the difference between ages, and then also looking specifically into genres, how a composer within the classical genre or a composer within the country genre, how they would differ within how musical identity was apparent in their life. So.
Terrific. Thank you very much.